The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Westminster Abbey, casting golden streams of light across the ancient stone floors. Inside the historic building, hundreds of guests had gathered for a special service celebrating the Commonwealth. The air was thick with anticipation and the subtle scent of fresh flowers that adorned every corner of the sacred space. Among the distinguished attendees sat members of the British royal family, each positioned according to protocol and tradition that had been carefully planned weeks in advance. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat with perfect posture in her designated seat. She wore an elegant navy blue coat dress that complemented her graceful demeanor. Her dark hair was styled simply, pulled back to reveal the delicate pearl earrings that had once belonged to Princess Diana. There was something particularly radiant about her that day, a quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from within. She had been feeling unwell in recent weeks, though few people knew the extent of her struggles. The morning had been difficult, but she had insisted on attending this important event. Her sense of duty had always been unshakable even when her body protested. Next to her sat Prince William, dressed in his military uniform with medals gleaming on his chest. He appeared focused on the ceremony unfolding before them, his expression serious as befitting the solemn occasion. The choir's voices rose in harmony, filling the abbey with sounds that had echoed through these walls for centuries. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered, and speeches were delivered about unity and shared values across nations. Everything seemed to be proceeding exactly as planned, following the schedule that had been rehearsed multiple times. But something was shifting in that sacred space, something that cameras would later capture, and the world would endlessly discuss. Catherine had been feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the service progressed. A wave of dizziness had washed over her during the third hymn, making the faces around her blur slightly. She gripped the edge of the wooden pew a bit tighter, willing herself to remain steady. She had become an expert at hiding discomfort, at maintaining composure when everything inside her wanted to collapse. Years in the public eye had taught her how to smile through pain, how to stand when sitting seemed impossible. William noticed immediately. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when his wife was struggling, even when she gave no outward sign. Perhaps it was the slight change in her breathing, or the way her fingers pressed a bit too firmly against the polished wood. Maybe it was the barely perceptible tension in her shoulders, or something indefinable that only a husband of many years could detect. Whatever the signal was, it reached him clearly. His attention, which had been directed toward the altar, shifted completely. The ceremony, the guests, the importance of the occasion suddenly all faded into background noise. In that moment, sitting in one of the most public spaces in Britain, surrounded by dignitaries and cameras, William did something remarkably simple yet profoundly moving. He turned his head toward Catherine, not quickly or dramatically, but with a gentle, deliberate movement. His eyes found hers, and in them was an expression that transcended royal protocol and public duty. It was the look of a man completely devoted to the woman beside him, a gaze filled with concern, love, and an unspoken question asking if she was all right. There was tenderness there, a vulnerability that royals rarely show in public. His entire being seemed focused on her well-being in that single moment. Catherine met his gaze, and something passed between them that needed no words. It was the kind of communication that exists between two people who have weathered storms together, who have built a life on trust and partnership. Her eyes conveyed both her struggle and her gratitude for his concern. She gave the tiniest nod, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but William understood. She was telling him she could continue, that she would make it through this service, but she also acknowledged that he had seen her truth. The mask had slipped for just a second, and he had been there to witness it. What neither of them realized in that quiet exchange was that they were being watched by someone else with equal intensity. Several seats away sat King Charles, Catherine's father-in-law and the newly crowned monarch of the United Kingdom. He had been observing the interaction between his son and daughter-in-law with an expression that palace insiders would later describe as deeply emotional. Charles had always been known for his sensitivity, his tendency toward reflection and feeling, traits that had sometimes been criticized during his long years as heir to the throne. But in this moment, that emotional depth allowed him to recognize something profound unfolding before him. The king saw more than just a husband checking on his wife. He witnessed the kind of genuine love and partnership that he himself had struggled to find for so many years. His own marriage to Diana had been complicated and ultimately tragic, filled with misunderstandings and incompatibility, despite their initial hope and the public fairy tale. His relationship with Camilla had been hard-won, fought for against tremendous public opposition and personal cost. Watching William and Catherine, he saw what a royal marriage could be when built on a foundation of true friendship and mutual support. There was something both beautiful and painful in the observation. Charles felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Here was his son, the future king, showing such tender concern for his wife in the middle of a formal ceremony. Here was Catherine, beloved by the British people, struggling silently with her own challenges while maintaining her commitment to duty. The parallel to his own mother, Queen Elizabeth, was impossible to ignore. She too had prioritized duty above all else, had suffered through personal difficulties while maintaining public composure. But there was something different here, something that gave Charles hope for the future of the monarchy. William and Catherine seemed to have found a way to balance duty with genuine human connection. The service continued around them, but these three people were locked in their own separate experiences of the same moment. Catherine focused on steadying her breath and maintaining her composure. William remained alert to any sign that his wife might need to leave, ready to support her however necessary. And Charles observed them both, his mind wandering through memories of his own journey, his own struggles with love and duty, and his hopes for the next generation. The afternoon light continued to stream through the windows, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its golden rays, yet somehow making everything feel more significant, more timeless. Nobody in the Abbey, except perhaps these three, understood that something meaningful was occurring beyond the planned ceremony. The photographers captured images without knowing they were documenting something that would resonate far beyond a typical royal appearance. The guests focused on the speakers and the music, unaware of the silent communication happening in the royal pews. But for William, Catherine, and Charles, this was a moment that would linger in memory, a quiet scene of love, observation, and reflection that spoke to the very human experiences hidden behind royal titles and public duties. The service at Westminster Abbey finally concluded with a magnificent organ recessional that filled every corner of the ancient building. Guests began to rise from their seats, the rustle of formal clothing and whispered conversations creating a gentle din. Catherine stood carefully, accepting William's discreetly offered arm for support. To any casual observer, it appeared to be nothing more than the traditional courtesy of a gentleman toward his wife. But William's grip was firm, protective, and Catherine leaned into it slightly more than she typically would. They moved together through the Abbey, nodding graciously to other guests, their public faces perfectly in place. King Charles watched them navigate through the crowd with practiced ease. He had been doing this kind of thing his entire life, performing for an invisible audience even in supposedly private royal gatherings. Every movement was observed, every interaction analyzed and interpreted by watching eyes. Yet William seemed to have mastered something that Charles had struggled with for decades. The younger prince moved through public spaces with confidence, but never at the expense of his personal values or his care for those closest to him. Where Charles had often felt torn between duty and desire, William appeared to have found a way to integrate both. As the royal family exited the Abbey into the cool London air, a crowd of well-wishers had gathered behind barriers. They cheered and waved flags, phones held high to capture photos and videos. Catherine's face transformed into a warm smile as she waved to the crowd, though William noticed the slight tightness around her eyes that others would miss. She had always been remarkable at this part of the job, connecting with ordinary people in a way that made them feel seen and valued. Even now, battling her own physical challenges, she prioritized making others feel acknowledged and appreciated. The journey back to their residence was quiet. Inside the official car, away from cameras and crowds, Catherine finally allowed herself to show her exhaustion. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. William reached over and took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. No words were needed. After more than a decade of marriage, they had developed a shorthand of gestures and glances that conveyed entire conversations. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, a soothing rhythm that had become their private language of comfort. Meanwhile, King Charles returned to his own quarters with a heart heavy with reflection. His wife Camilla had noticed his unusual quietness during the car ride home. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when something was weighing on his mind. Charles had always been a deeply thoughtful person, prone to contemplation and occasionally melancholy. But there was something different in his silence today, something that seemed less troubled and more wistful. She decided to wait, knowing that he would share his thoughts when ready. That evening, Charles sat in his private study, a room filled with personal photographs and paintings he had created over the years. His eyes kept returning to a framed photo of William and Catherine on their wedding day. They had looked so young then, so hopeful and somewhat nervous about the journey ahead. The weight of their future responsibilities had been present even in that joyful moment, visible in the seriousness behind their smiles. Now, years later, they had grown into their roles in ways that exceeded even Charles's optimistic hopes for them. He thought about the moment in the Abbey, replaying it in his mind. The way William had looked at Catherine with such unguarded concern and love had reminded Charles of something he had read once about true partnership. A good marriage, someone had written, is not about never facing difficulties but about facing them together with unwavering support. William and Catherine embodied this principle. They had certainly faced their share of challenges over the years: intense media scrutiny, the demands of royal duty, family tensions, and now Catherine's health struggles. Yet they seemed to emerge from each trial more united than before. Charles picked up his phone and typed a brief message to William. He was not naturally comfortable with emotional expressions, having been raised in a time and family where such things were considered private or even weak. But he had learned, painfully and slowly, that unexpressed feelings could create distance and misunderstanding. He wrote simply, "I noticed your care for Catherine today. It reminded me what truly matters. Very proud of you both." He hesitated before sending it, second-guessing the sentiment as too sentimental or perhaps too personal. But then he remembered Catherine's pale face in the Abbey, William's instant and complete focus on her, and he pressed send. William was helping Catherine prepare for bed when the message arrived. She was already in comfortable clothes. Her formal attire hung carefully in the wardrobe for the palace staff to collect and clean. The makeup had been washed away, revealing the natural beauty that William loved most. She looked young and vulnerable without the armor of her public appearance, and he was reminded once again how much strength it required for her to face the world day after day, while dealing with her private battles. He showed her the message from his father, and Catherine's eyes filled with unexpected tears. She had always felt a special affection for Charles. Despite his reputation for being somewhat formal and occasionally awkward, she had found him to be genuinely kind and welcoming, from her first days as William's girlfriend. Charles had made efforts to include her, to help her understand the strange world she was entering. He had recognized her nervousness and done his best to put her at ease, often with his self-deprecating humor about his own struggles with royal life. Over the years, she had come to appreciate his sensitivity and his honest desire to be a better parent to his sons than his own upbringing had modeled. William typed a response to his father, keeping it brief but heartfelt. "Thank you. That means a great deal to both of us." Then he set the phone aside and focused entirely on Catherine, who was now settled into bed but still looked fragile. He sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She had been his anchor for so many years, the person who made the impossible demands of royal life bearable. Now it was his turn to be her anchor, to provide the steady support she had always given him. He would not fail her. In his study, Charles read William's response and felt a warmth spread through his chest. Communication between father and son had not always been easy. There had been years when William blamed Charles for the breakdown of his parents' marriage, when anger and hurt created walls between them. The death of Diana had only complicated those feelings, leaving William grieving and confused about his relationship with his father. But time, therapy, and William's own experience with marriage and parenthood had softened those hard edges. They had found their way to a new understanding, not perfect, but genuine and growing stronger with each passing year. The king thought about the institution he now led and what it needed to survive in a changing world. The monarchy had endured for over 1,000 years by adapting to new circumstances while maintaining core traditions. But perhaps the most important adaptation was not about protocols or modernizing public relations. Perhaps it was about showing that royals were human beings capable of genuine love and connection. William and Catherine understood this instinctively in a way that previous generations had struggled to grasp. They could be formal when required, but they never lost sight of their humanity or each other. Charles picked up his pen and began writing in his journal, a practice he had maintained for decades. He wrote about the moment in the Abbey, trying to capture the feeling it had evoked in him. He wrote about his hopes for William and Catherine, for their ability to balance duty with personal well-being in ways he had never quite managed. He wrote about the future of the monarchy and his belief that it would be safe in their hands not because they were perfect, but because they truly cared for each other and understood that their strength came from that bond. As he wrote, he felt the tightness in his throat return, but this time it was accompanied by something that felt like peace. The following morning brought a fresh perspective but also new challenges. Catherine woke feeling slightly better than the previous day, though the improvement was marginal. William had already been up for an hour, having taken a call from his private secretary about upcoming engagements. He returned to their bedroom with a tray carrying tea and toast, simple things that Catherine's sensitive stomach might tolerate. She smiled at his thoughtfulness, though they both knew that even these basic foods might prove difficult. The uncertainty of her condition had become their new normal, requiring constant adjustment and patience. Across London, King Charles began his own day with a series of briefings about state matters. His role as monarch came with endless responsibilities and very little personal freedom. Every day was planned weeks in advance, every minute accounted for in a schedule that allowed almost no spontaneity. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the previous day's observation. During a pause between meetings, he found himself looking at official photographs from the Abbey service that had been sent to his office for approval before public release. One photo in particular caught his attention. The image captured William and Catherine in profile, their faces turned toward each other in that tender moment Charles had witnessed. The photographer had caught something special, though they probably had not realized it while clicking the shutter. The look on William's face was unguarded, protective, filled with concern that transcended his royal training. Catherine's expression reflected both vulnerability and trust, her eyes meeting her husband's with complete openness. It was the kind of photograph that told a story beyond the official event, revealing the humans behind the titles. Charles studied the image for several minutes, his morning tea growing cold beside him. He thought about his own experiences with public scrutiny of personal relationships. His courtship with Camilla had been dissected by the media for decades, their every interaction analyzed and often portrayed in the harshest possible light. The contrast between that experience and what William and Catherine seemed to have was striking. The public genuinely loved Catherine, supported their marriage, and rooted for their success. This was partly due to Catherine's own character and her genuine approach to royal duties, but it was also because people could see the authentic love between them. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His private secretary entered with more documents requiring his attention. Charles approved the photo for public release, knowing it would likely receive significant attention but believing that was acceptable. Sometimes showing the human side of the monarchy was more important than maintaining a completely formal distance. The public needed to see that royals were capable of real emotion, real love, real partnership. These things made the institution relatable and sustainable for future generations. Later that afternoon, Catherine had a private appointment with her medical team. William accompanied her, as he had to every appointment since her health concerns began. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but stressed the importance of rest and reduced stress. Catherine nodded at their advice, though both she and William knew that completely stepping back from public duties was not realistic. Her role was not just a job she could temporarily leave. Every absence was noticed, commented upon, and speculated about. The pressure to appear healthy and engaged was constant, even when her body desperately needed recovery time. In the car returning from the appointment, Catherine stared out the window at London passing by. People went about their normal lives, shopping, working, meeting friends, making plans for their weekends. Sometimes she envied that normalcy, the ability to simply exist without constant observation and judgment. William reached over and squeezed her hand, understanding without words what she was feeling. He had grown up with this life and had long accepted its limitations, But he had also watched Catherine navigate the transition from normal life to royal existence, and he knew how much she had sacrificed to be with him. That evening, the family gathered for a private dinner at Clarence's house. Charles had invited William, Catherine, and their children for an informal meal, something that happened occasionally but not frequently enough, given everyone's busy schedules. The children brought energy and laughter to the gathering, their innocent joy temporarily pushing aside the heavier concerns of their parents and grandfather. Charles watched his grandchildren with obvious delight, asking about their school activities and genuinely listening to their enthusiastic responses. After dinner, while the children played in an adjacent room under the watchful eye of their nanny, the adults shared coffee in Charles's private sitting room. The conversation flowed easily between topics ranging from palace renovations to upcoming tours. But there was an undercurrent of unspoken concern about Catherine's health that everyone felt but no one directly addressed. Finally, Charles broke the unspoken agreement to avoid the difficult subject. He looked directly at Catherine and asked simply how she was really doing, emphasizing the word really to make clear he wanted truth, not polite deflection. Catherine appreciated his directness. She had grown weary of carefully worded responses that revealed nothing, while appearing to say something. With Charles, she felt safe being honest. She explained that the uncertainty was perhaps the hardest part. She could face a clear diagnosis and treatment plan, but the ambiguity of not knowing exactly what was wrong or how long recovery might take was mentally and emotionally exhausting. She spoke about the guilt she felt when canceling engagements, disappointing organizations that had planned events around her attendance, and worrying about letting down the people who had come to rely on her presence and support. William listened to his wife articulate feelings he knew she carried but rarely expressed so openly. His hand found hers again, that constant physical connection that grounded them both. He added that they were learning to set boundaries, to prioritize Catherine's health even when it disappointed others or attracted criticism. It was not easy, he admitted, especially when they both had been raised to believe that duty always came first. But they were trying to find a more sustainable approach, one that acknowledged human limitations while still fulfilling their responsibilities as much as possible. Charles listened with complete attention, his eyes moving between his son and daughter-in-law. When they finished speaking, he was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he shared something he had rarely discussed so openly. He talked about his own struggles with the weight of duty, the times when he had felt crushed by expectations and unable to live authentically. He spoke about the cost of always putting the institution first, how it had damaged relationships and created regrets he still carried. His voice became thick with emotion as he told them that their approach, prioritizing their relationship and Catherine's health while still serving the crown, was not a weakness but profound wisdom. Charles revealed that watching them in the Abbey the previous day had moved him deeply because it represented something he wished he had understood earlier in his own life. The monarchy would survive, he said, not by demanding inhuman perfection from its members, but by allowing them to be genuinely human while fulfilling their roles. William and Catherine were showing a new way forward, and he was grateful for it. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning and years of lived experience. Catherine felt tears threatening again, touched by his vulnerability and his support. William felt a shift in his relationship with his father in that moment. The resentments and misunderstandings that had marked their past seemed to dissolve a bit more. He saw Charles not as the man who had failed his mother or who had made questionable choices, but as a person who had struggled under impossible pressures and was still trying to figure out how to do better. There was something healing in this mutual recognition of struggle and the shared commitment to supporting each other through difficult times. The family they were becoming was not the fairy tale the public imagined, but it was real, and it was growing stronger through honest conversation and mutual support. As the evening concluded and William and Catherine prepared to leave with their children, Charles embraced them both warmly. He held Catherine a moment longer, whispering that she should never hesitate to ask for help or to step back when needed. The institution would adapt, he assured her, because she was more important than any single engagement or appearance. Catherine thanked him, genuinely moved by his fatherly concern. William shook his father's hand but then pulled him into a hug, something that had become more common between them in recent years but still felt significant each time it happened. The photograph from Westminster Abbey was released to the public 3 days later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media platforms flooded with comments about the tender moment captured between William and Catherine. People who had never particularly followed the royal family found themselves moved by the obvious love and concern visible in the image. News outlets across the world ran stories analyzing the photograph, with body language experts and royal commentators offering their interpretations of what the moment revealed. About the couple's relationship, Catherine saw some of the coverage while scrolling through her tablet during a rare quiet morning. William had left early for a military engagement, and she was having breakfast alone in their private quarters. Reading the public's reaction to such a personal moment felt strange and somewhat invasive. That exchange in the Abbey had been real and unplanned, a genuine moment of connection between husband and wife. Now it was being dissected and discussed by millions of strangers. Yet she could not deny that most of the commentary was positive, even beautiful. People saw in that photograph what they wanted to believe about love and partnership. One article particularly caught her attention. A respected journalist had written about how the photograph represented a shift in how modern royals approached their public roles. Previous generations had maintained rigid formal distance, rarely showing affection or vulnerability in public settings. But William and Catherine's generation understood that connection with the public required showing their humanity, not hiding it. The article suggested that this authentic approach was crucial for the monarchy's survival, in an age where deference to authority could no longer be assumed, but had to be earned through genuine relatability. Catherine thought about this analysis as she sipped her tea. She had never consciously tried to change how royals behaved in public. She simply did not know how to be anyone other than herself, even with cameras constantly watching. The formal protocols and expectations had been challenging to learn, and she still sometimes worried about making mistakes. But pretending not to love her husband or hiding her struggles had never seemed like viable options. Perhaps her inability to be anything other than genuine had accidentally become her greatest strength in this role. Meanwhile, King Charles was dealing with his own reaction to the public attention on the photograph. His communications team had compiled a report on media coverage and public sentiment, as they did for all significant royal news. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with approval ratings for William and Catherine reaching new highs. But what struck Charles most were the personal stories people shared online about their own experiences with illness, caregiving, and the importance of having a supportive partner during difficult times. The photograph had resonated far beyond royal watching circles and had become a symbol of love and support that transcended titles and privilege. Charles called a meeting with his senior advisors to discuss how the family's public approach might need to evolve. For too long, he argued, the monarchy had relied on mystique and distance to maintain its position, but the modern world demanded connection and authenticity. He pointed to William and Catherine as examples of how royals could be both dignified and genuine, both formal when required and human always. Some of the older advisors resisted this thinking, worried about losing the specialness that came from maintaining distance. But Charles was firm in his belief that evolution was necessary for survival. Back at their residence, William returned from his military event to find Catherine in thoughtful mood. She shared the article she had read and her reflections on it. William listened carefully, then offered his own perspective. He explained that showing genuine emotion in public had never been easy for him either. He had been trained from childhood to control his expressions and maintain composure regardless of circumstances. But losing his mother had taught him that some things were more important than protocol. Life was too short and too precious to pretend not to feel what he genuinely felt, especially regarding the people he loved most. Catherine understood this better than anyone. She had watched William struggle with his grief and guilt surrounding his mother's death for years. She had seen how the public expectation that he mourn in a certain way, or move on according to someone else's timeline, had complicated his healing process. In some ways, their marriage had been an act of rebellion against the expectation that royals should sacrifice personal happiness for duty. They had chosen each other fully aware of the difficulties their life together would involve, but determined to prioritize their relationship even within the constraints of royal life. That evening they attended a small charity dinner, one of Catherine's patronages that worked with families facing serious illness. It was a difficult event for Catherine personally, given her own health struggles, but also meaningful, She spoke with parents caring for sick children, with patients fighting their own battles, with healthcare workers dedicating their lives to helping others. Their courage and resilience put her own challenges in perspective. She felt humbled by their strength and grateful for the relatively privileged position from which she faced her own difficulties. During the dinner, several people mentioned having seen the photograph from Westminster Abbey. They told Catherine how much it had meant to them to see someone in the public eye showing vulnerability and receiving obvious support from their partner. One woman, whose husband had died after a long illness, said that seeing William's protective gaze toward Catherine had reminded her of her own husband's devotion during her difficult times. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she spoke, and Catherine reached out to hold her hand, her own eyes moist with empathy and emotion. William observed this interaction from across the room where he was speaking with other guests. He saw his wife connecting deeply with someone experiencing grief and hardship, offering genuine comfort without pretense or platitude. This was who Catherine truly was beneath the royal title and public persona, a woman of deep empathy and authentic kindness. He felt a surge of love and admiration for her, along with frustration at her illness that was making everything more difficult. He wanted to protect her from every challenge, to shield her from pain and struggle, but he knew that was impossible. All he could do was be present, supportive, and ready to help however she needed. After the dinner in the car returning home, Catherine was exhausted, but also emotionally full from the meaningful conversations she had experienced. She told William about the widow who had mentioned their photograph, about how something so simple as a loving glance had provided comfort to someone grieving. It reminded her that their public role, despite its many difficulties and invasions of privacy, occasionally created opportunities to touch people's lives in unexpected ways. Perhaps that was the trade-off they had to accept, giving up normal privacy in exchange for the platform to make positive differences, however small. William agreed, but added that it should not require sacrificing her health or their family's well-being. They needed to find better balance, and he was determined to help create that balance, even if it meant pushing back against expectations or disappointing people occasionally. Catherine was too important to him. Their children needed their mother healthy, and no public engagement was worth risking her recovery. His voice was firm, almost fierce, in a way that reminded Catherine why she had fallen in love with him. Beneath the polite public prince was a man capable of great passion and fierce protectiveness toward those he loved. Later that night, after the children were asleep and they had finally settled into their own bed, Catherine thought about everything that had unfolded since that moment in Westminster Abbey. A simple turning of heads, a brief exchange of glances, had somehow captured public imagination and sparked broader conversations about love, duty, and authenticity in public life. She had not planned for any of it, had simply responded honestly to feeling unwell and being grateful for her husband's concern. Yet that honest moment had resonated with people far beyond the Abbey's walls. She thought about King Charles, too, about his emotional reaction and his subsequent support and vulnerability during their dinner conversation. The royal family was changing slowly but genuinely. The rigid formality that had characterized previous generations was giving way to something more human and sustainable. It was not about abandoning duty or tradition, but about recognizing that duty could be fulfilled by whole humans with needs and limitations, not by people pretending to be superhuman and invulnerable. This evolution was necessary and healthy, even if it sometimes felt uncomfortable or uncertain. William was already asleep beside her, his breathing deep and steady. Catherine watched him in the dim light filtering through their curtains, studying his familiar features softened by sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, more engagements and obligations, more careful balancing of public duty and private needs. But tonight, in this quiet moment, she felt grateful for what they had built together, a partnership strong enough to weather difficulties, authentic enough to resonate with others, and loving enough to sustain them both through whatever lay ahead. She closed her eyes and let herself drift toward sleep. Several weeks passed after the Westminster Abbey service, and life gradually settled into a new rhythm for the Wales family. Catherine's health remained unpredictable, with good days and difficult ones appearing without clear pattern. The medical team had finally provided a more concrete diagnosis and treatment plan, which brought relief even though the road ahead would be challenging. Knowledge, even of difficult things, was easier to handle than uncertainty. William had cleared his schedule as much as possible to be present for treatments and to help with the children during Catherine's recovery. Periods King Charles had taken a personal interest in ensuring that William and Catherine felt supported during this time. He had quietly instructed palace communications teams to be more protective of their privacy, to push back against intrusive media requests, and to provide cover for any last-minute cancellations of engagements without requiring detailed explanations. This was not how things had traditionally been handled. Previous generations would have expected stoic silence and continued public appearances, regardless of personal circumstances. But Charles was determined to do better for his son and daughter-in-law than had been done for him during his own difficult periods. The king's protective approach did not go unnoticed by William. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling treatment session that had left Catherine exhausted and uncomfortable, William received a call from his father checking on how things were going. It was not an official call about royal business, but a genuine personal inquiry from a father and grandfather concerned about his family. The conversation was brief, as Catherine needed rest and William wanted to be available if she needed anything, but it left William feeling grateful and somewhat emotional about how their relationship had deepened. During Catherine's recovery periods, when she was physically unable to maintain her usual schedule, William found himself reflecting more deeply on the impossible demands placed on royal women throughout history. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had served with extraordinary dedication for over 70 years, rarely showing any sign of personal struggle or vulnerability. His mother, Diana, had been expected to maintain a perfect public image while privately falling apart, under pressures she was too young and unsupported to handle. Now Catherine, who had tried so hard to live up to the example set before her, was being forced to acknowledge her own human limitations. What troubled William most was recognizing how much of Catherine's current situation might have been prevented or at least lessened if they had felt more freedom to prioritize her well-being earlier. She had pushed herself to fulfill every obligation, attend every engagement, and meet every expectation without complaint. She had wanted to prove herself worthy of the role she had married into, to show that a commoner could successfully become a future queen. In doing so, she had ignored warning signs from her body and postponed dealing with health concerns until they could no longer be ignored. William felt guilty for not insisting sooner that they slow down and reassess priorities. Catherine, during her periods of forced rest, found herself having similar reflections. She had always been driven even before meeting William. Growing up outside the royal bubble, she had learned that achievement required hard work and persistence. When she entered the royal family, she applied that same determination to mastering her new role. But now she understood that the old model of royal duty, the expectation of endless service without regard for personal cost, was not sustainable, especially for women who were also expected to be wives and mothers, while maintaining impossible standards of appearance and behavior. One evening, as Catherine sat in her favorite chair with a blanket tucked around her, William brought her tea and settled nearby. They talked about what needed to change both for their own family and potentially for the institution more broadly. They discussed how expectations for royal women seemed particularly crushing. They were supposed to look perfect always, never show signs of aging or fatigue, support their husbands while maintaining their own independent work, be devoted mothers who were somehow always available, yet also fulfilling constant public obligations, and do all of this with gracious smiles and no complaints. It was an impossible standard, and pretending it was achievable only harmed the women who tried to meet it. William suggested that perhaps their current difficult situation could ultimately lead to positive change. If they could be honest about Catherine's health challenges and their decision to prioritize her recovery over public expectations, maybe it would make things easier for future royal women. Maybe it would help shift the culture away from the destructive expectation of superhuman endurance. Catherine appreciated his optimism, but worried about the vulnerability such honesty would require. Opening up about her struggles meant inviting public judgment and speculation, something that terrified her even as she recognized it might be necessary. King Charles, in his own circles, was advocating for exactly this kind of cultural shift. During meetings with senior palace staff, he emphasized that supporting the well-being of family members was not a distraction from their duties, but essential to their ability to fulfill those duties long-term. He pointed out that his mother's incredible endurance had been remarkable, but had also come at personal costs that should not be expected of future generations. The world had changed, public attitudes had evolved, and the monarchy needed to adapt by showing that royals were human beings, deserving of the same basic considerations as anyone else. Not everyone agreed with Charles's perspective. Some traditionalists argued that mystery and distance had always been key to the monarchy's special status, and that showing too much vulnerability would diminish public respect. But Charles countered that respect could no longer be demanded purely based on birthright. Modern respect had to be earned through genuine service and authentic connection, and that required showing enough humanity for people to relate to royals as real people facing real challenges. The photograph from Westminster Abbey had proven his point. People had responded positively precisely because it showed authentic emotion and connection. As weeks turned into months, Catherine's health gradually improved under proper treatment and with reduced stress from a lighter schedule. The public had been told she was dealing with health issues requiring rest and treatment, without going into specific details. The response had been overwhelmingly supportive, with thousands of messages pouring in from people around the world wishing her well. Many people shared their own stories of health struggles and the importance of taking time to heal properly. The outpouring of genuine affection reminded Catherine that the public's interest in her was not purely voyeuristic, but reflected genuine care and connection. William watched his wife slowly regain her strength and vitality with profound relief. The experience had been frightening, and had forced him to confront the possibility of loss in ways he had not fully dealt with since his mother's death. But it had also strengthened his resolve to protect what mattered most. He had learned that he could push back against expectations, that he could prioritize his family, even when it disappointed others, and that doing so did not make him a failure as a royal, but actually made him better able to serve when he did engage publicly. One afternoon, Catherine felt well enough to take a walk in the private gardens with William. The weather was beautiful, with spring flowers beginning to bloom and birds singing in nearby trees. They walked slowly, hand in hand, not talking much but simply enjoying being together outside after so many weeks of Catherine being confined indoors. William studied her face, noting the return of color to her cheeks and the brightness returning to her eyes. She caught him watching and smiled, that radiant smile that had first captured his heart years ago. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, grateful beyond words that she was recovering. Catherine leaned against her husband, drawing strength from his solid presence. She thought about that moment in Westminster Abbey that now felt like it had happened in another lifetime. So much had changed since then, both in terms of her health journey and in her understanding of what really mattered. She had learned that being vulnerable was not weakness, that asking for help was not failure, and that love meant allowing yourself to be truly seen and supported by another person. These lessons had not come easily, and she knew there would still be difficult days ahead. But she also knew with certainty that she and William would face whatever came together, with honesty and mutual support rather than pretense and stoic isolation. 6 months after the Westminster Abbey service, Catherine made her first major public appearance since beginning treatment. The event was carefully chosen, a visit to a children's hospital, one of her longtime patronages where she had always felt most comfortable and purposeful. William accompanied her, as he had to every engagement since her health crisis began. The palace had made clear that this was a gradual return to duties, and that Catherine would continue prioritizing her health and recovery above all else. The message was unprecedented in its directness about balancing personal well-being with public responsibility. The morning of the hospital visit, Catherine felt nervous in a way she had not experienced in years. She had grown accustomed to public appearances, and usually felt confident in her ability to connect with people and fulfill her role effectively. But months away from the public eye had created uncertainty. Would she still be able to do this well? Would people judge her differently now that they knew she was not invincible? Would children sense her vulnerability and feel uncomfortable? William sensed her anxiety and spent extra time that morning reassuring her, reminding her that she did not have to be perfect and that her genuine care for people was what mattered most. At the hospital, staff and families greeted Catherine with warmth that immediately eased her concerns. Parents thanked her for coming despite her own health challenges, saying it meant even more knowing she understood personally what it meant to face medical difficulties. Children asked if she was feeling better and offered her their own advice for getting well, suggestions that ranged from practical to adorably nonsensical. Catherine found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, the tension she had been carrying dissolving in the presence of these resilient young patients and their devoted families. William watched his wife interact with the children and felt his heart swell with pride and love. This was who she truly was, most herself, when connecting with people in meaningful ways rather than performing for cameras at formal events. He saw the tiredness in her eyes by the end of the visit, knew that she had pushed herself to her current limits, but he also saw the satisfaction and joy that came from engaging in work that mattered to her. On the drive home, she was exhausted but happy, already talking about the next patronage she wanted to visit and the project she wanted to move forward on. King Charles watched news coverage of Catherine's hospital visit from his office and felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that she was recovering and able to return to public duties, pride in how she and William were handling this challenge with grace and authenticity, but also a deeper reflection on what this meant for the future of the institution he now led. The public response to Catherine's return had been overwhelmingly positive, precisely because she had been honest about her limitations and prioritized her health. People respected the choice to step back when needed and were genuinely happy to see her returning, gradually rather than pretending nothing had happened. This stood in stark contrast to how similar situations had been handled in previous generations. Illness or struggle had been hidden or minimized, with royals expected to maintain appearances regardless of personal cost. Charles thought about his own mother's unwavering commitment to duty, even in her final years when walking was painful and fatigue was constant. He had admired her dedication but also worried about the example it set and the expectations it created for future generations. Perhaps there was a better way, one that honored both service and humanity. Later that week, Charles invited William and Catherine to a private dinner, just the three of them without other family members or staff present, beyond those necessary for meal preparation. Over a simple but elegant meal, they talked about Catherine's return to work and how to manage going forward. Charles listened more than he spoke, asking questions and genuinely wanting to understand their perspective rather than imposing his own views. He was still learning how to be this kind of father and father-in-law, one who offered support rather than expectations, guidance rather than demands. Catherine shared her fear that taking time for her health had somehow let people down or failed in her duties. Charles responded with unexpected emotion, telling her that the opposite was true. By being honest about her limitations and needs, she had actually strengthened the monarchy's connection with ordinary people who faced similar struggles. She had made the institution more relatable and sustainable by showing that royals were human beings who sometimes needed to prioritize health and family. Far from failing, she had demonstrated a kind of leadership that was perhaps more important than any number of public engagements. William added that this experience had fundamentally changed how he thought about royal duty. He had been raised with the idea that service meant endless sacrifice, that personal needs always came second to public expectations, but watching Catherine struggle and recognizing how close they had come to a much worse outcome had made him realize that this model was not just unsustainable, but potentially dangerous. They needed to find a better balance, and that might mean disappointing people sometimes or doing things differently than previous generations had done them. He looked at his father as he said this, wondering if Charles would resist or criticize this perspective, but Charles surprised him by agreeing completely. The king spoke about his own struggles with the burden of duty, the times when he had felt crushed by expectations and unable to be authentic. He talked about mistakes he had made by prioritizing what others expected over what his heart told him was right. His voice grew thick as he acknowledged that some of those mistakes had caused pain to people he loved, including William himself. He said he did not want William and Catherine to repeat his errors, to sacrifice their well-being or their family's happiness on the altar of tradition and expectation. The institution would survive and adapt, but broken families and damaged health were much harder to repair. The conversation grew deeper and more emotional than any of them had anticipated. Catherine felt tears on her cheeks as she listened to Charles speak so honestly about his regrets and hopes. William reached across the table to grasp his father's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, but now felt natural and necessary. They sat together in that moment of shared vulnerability and understanding, three people trying to navigate impossible expectations while remaining true to themselves and each other. It was not a tidy resolution to complex problems, but it was genuine connection and mutual support. In the months that followed, Catherine continued her gradual return to public life, while maintaining firm boundaries about her schedule and energy levels. Some engagements were shortened, others were rescheduled or canceled when she needed rest. The palace communications were transparent about these decisions, without going into private medical details. The public response remained supportive, with most people appreciating the honesty and realistic approach to managing both duty and health. There were critics, of course, people who felt royals should simply push through difficulties without acknowledgement or adjustment, but they were in the minority. William found that his role had evolved in ways he had not anticipated. He had always known he would eventually be king, had been prepared for that responsibility his entire life, but now he understood that effective leadership in the modern monarchy meant something different than it had for previous generations. It meant being willing to show vulnerability, to prioritize people over protocols when necessary, to evolve traditions that no longer served their purpose. He was learning these lessons alongside Catherine, both of them figuring out how to be royals who were also fully human. King Charles watched his son and daughter-in-law navigate these challenges with growing confidence in the monarchy's future. They were not perfect, and they would make mistakes as everyone did. But they had something more important than perfection. They had genuine love for each other, commitment to their family, and an authentic desire to serve in ways that were sustainable and meaningful. The photograph from Westminster Abbey that had started this whole reflection remained on Charles's desk, a reminder of what truly mattered beneath all the ceremony and tradition. 1 year after that moment in the Abbey, the family gathered again for another Commonwealth service. Catherine was healthy and strong, though she remained mindful of her limits and careful about maintaining balance. When they took their seats in the same location where they had sat the year before, William and Catherine exchanged a look that carried the weight of everything they had been through. It was a look of triumph over difficulty, of gratitude for recovery, of love that had been tested and had emerged stronger. From his seat nearby, King Charles observed that exchange and felt his throat tighten again with emotion. But this time it was not tinged with regret or wistfulness. It was simply gratitude for the family they were becoming, and hope for the future they would build together. The service proceeded with its usual dignity and tradition, hymns and prayers filling the ancient space. But within that formal structure were three people who understood something profound about balancing duty with humanity, tradition with evolution, and service with self-care. They carried this understanding quietly, not per feel,